Hi, Pierce. It's nice to
Hey,
meet you.
yeah, good to
Will
meet
you
you.
will you tell me a little bit today about what your research is all about?
Sure. So I'm I guess most well known as a researcher of the interconnections between Buddhism and medicine, and I did my PhD on those connections in medieval China. So I've spent the last 15, 20 years researching how Chinese Buddhists thought about the body, about disease, about cure. And a lot of my research in that area has involved the reception of Indian medicine in China. So how Ayurvedic ideas were interpreted, understood, and translated into Chinese.
And I think that's amazing. I think a little bit that the co-op is geared toward making sure that the way we're educating our future practitioners is about making sure that they're literate, and that we continue to bring back into relevance the classical texts that we've been studying, only making sure we're really digging deep into the translation work and to getting to understand the true meanings behind some of these classical texts. Can you talk a little bit about how your work intersects with that kind of work as well?
Yeah, definitely. So the period of Chinese history that I work on is the medieval period. So this is like 3rd to 10th century. And this is a period of time during which the medical system of China was not centrally controlled. There wasn't a sort of a systematized central authority in terms of how physicians were being trained. So the acupuncture classics from the Han Dynasty, or the Chinese medical classics more generally from the Han Dynasty, were in circulation, but there were a whole lot of other ideas and systems and practices that were in circulation too, various kinds of healing modalities and systems from all kinds of different circles, Taoist, Buddhist, popular healing, shamanic, depending on different parts of China. There was a different mix. And China for a good part of the period that I study was not unified either into one empire. And then also it was very interconnected across the Silk Roads with Central and Southeast and Central, South and Southeast Asia. So the medical pluralism of medieval China is often, I think, underappreciated. People sort of think about, there's acupuncture and Chinese herbal traditions and so forth that go back to the Han Dynasty, and it just kind of was, like one note for that whole historical span, and that's not true at all. And so the period of time that I look at, Buddhist therapies were, I would argue, equally, if not more popular among the general public than the sort of imperial system of Chinese medicine. That came to an abrupt and dramatic change in the 12th century when the Song Dynasty codified the imperial medical system and purged a lot of these more religious and more foreign ideas out of the Chinese medical tradition. So if you're interested in sort of like historical literacy about the range of different healing techniques and ideas that circulated in China historically, Buddhist medicine is interesting for that reason. It's also interesting because there's a lot of remnants of Buddhist ideas that got actually scooped up into this Song Dynasty reformation of medicine, kind of below the radar. So it's not overtly Buddhist in many cases, and kind of got this kind of subterranean Buddhist influence on Chinese medicine that remained a factor down to the present. But also, aside from that, overtly, while this kind of synthesis of Chinese medicine that I'm talking about in the Song Dynasty really affected kind of elite medicine at the popular everyday level, all kinds of Buddhist therapies continue to be done really widely across society and continue to be popular today all around the Chinese speaking world. So it's important for training of Chinese healers of the modern era, just to understand this, the Chinese medical heritage is just so much more diverse and pluralistic than just, the Huangqi Neijing.
I feel like we dance around this issue of religion in the medicine quite a bit. And I'm the kind of person who sort of says, all right, you say this kind of religion, I say this kind of religion, but like if you look at them, they're really close enough that we could just talk about like generic ways of being a good person, and you say tomato, I say tomato. So that's my feeling on religion in general. But I feel like oftentimes as practitioners, we dance around the concept of how much sort of religion or even mysticism is involved in the medicine that we practice. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that as well, if you have time.
Yeah, this is actually something I've spent a lot of time writing about and thinking about and talking about. So I think it's important to understand that the term religion is, and in the way that we're using it in this conversation,
Clarify the
is
vocabulary.
yeah, well, it's a
Construct.
modern concept, right? And it originates in early modern Europe, and it subsequently gets applied back to other times and places where it may or may not be the best fit. And so I've written a lot about the medieval Chinese cultural climate, making the argument that it is actually it obscures more than it helps, to bring these terms religion and medicine as two separate things into that cultural climate, and try to parse out what's religion and what's medicine. Because really, any group that you might want to identify as being religious, turns out they have ideas and therapy and ideas about disease and cure and specific therapies that they're advocating. And then anything that you want to point to in medieval China and say, oh, this is medicine, turns out to have this whole kind of cosmological, mythological, magical kind of framework that it's understood through. So to me, religion and medicine are inseparable in medieval China, for sure. And I would say probably for most of pre-modern Chinese history that this was these realms that we would want to call religion and medicine were actually very tightly interwoven. Now, there were individual people that came along at certain periods of time throughout history and tried to argue, like, oh, we should remove this from medicine because it's witchcraft, or it's superstition, or what have you. So there was an ongoing kind of debate over where these lines are, and whether there is something sort of that we could call secular medicine in Chinese history, is something that's a historical question that historians are debating. But in my corner of the Sinology world, the kinds of texts that I look at, the kinds of cultural circles, intellectual circles that I study in medieval China, I've come to use the word religio medicine, sort of like combining it all together, because I find that they really are inseparable.
We were talking last night a little bit. The video is going to be on the website soon, hopefully. But we were talking a bit last night about how Western medicine is very good at splitting the Shen and the earth. And the character that we were discussing was the character for Zheng Qi, upright Qi, right? And we were looking at the seal form and what the representations were in that. But that ultimately what we're talking about is that connection between heaven and earth, and that that your Qi bridges that. And I think so often we try to ascribe labels to those things so that we can sort of like corner them away, but that doesn't do service to what it means to heal a whole human being, right? And as a student of Chinese medicine, I hear what you're saying in terms of the involvement of Buddhism and the involvement of the Ayurvedic medicine. Like we see that, we do learn about that in school. What are the kinds of things that you think are not being taught to practitioners today about this area of your research that is sort of important to you, that we need to sort of get out there and that we should be talking about, we should be discussing?
Yeah. So I'll just like tie up a couple of threads that you opened up there, by saying that one of the things that's interesting to me is in the translation of Indian medicine that arrives in China inside of these Buddhist texts, right? So there's a whole sort of Buddhist worldview also coming from India, and they're being translated into Chinese. Is that throughout the medieval period, there's hundreds of texts that were translated throughout this period. So you can kind of like get a sense of the practice of translators, and you kind of get a sense of how different translators in different time periods kind of approach some of these questions. This is a lot of what my initial research was on, was just kind of how did they understand this and translate this material. It turns out that in Indian medicine and the Buddhist kind of worldview is fundamentally different than the Chinese worldview, the Chinese medical worldview. So, India has a very different cosmology. Buddhism has a completely different orientation towards the world than sort of the Chinese, typical Chinese worldview would say. And the medicine is based on, I think, fundamentally opposed principles, or fundamentally different principles. And so one thing that's interesting is to see how translators choose to do with that when they translate these foreign concepts into Chinese. And in some cases they kind of like what I call domesticate the translations. They kind of make Indian medicine and Indian ideas sound more like they're compatible with Chinese worldviews. And then sometimes they really foreignize the medicine, which is to make it sound like, whoa, this is so different than what we've got here in China. And there's a whole sort of like balance between to what extent are we trying to be faithful to the original and really understand what the Indian medicine's all about, versus to what extent are we trying to make this fit within our culture and kind of like serve our own purposes, right? So there's a whole kind of spectrum of different ideas about that. Anyway, that's exactly what we're doing today as non-Chinese people living in the West, taking up these medical systems that we don't have a cultural connection with or a family connection with. Most cases don't speak the language, aren't steeped in the culture. And we're doing the exact same thing, right? We're picking up these foreign medical concepts, and we're as a community, then trying to figure out, like, how do we translate these? How do we present these in the modern Western sort of like, marketplace?
Fit into this, right?
Yeah. And so you have the same range of, it's a completely different time and place and vocabularies and all that, but the dynamics are still kind of, I think, quite similar, where you have individuals, that some might try to domesticate this and interpret, qi as electromagnetism, or qi is, whatever biomedical correlates, whatever, we can study it using randomized controlled clinical trials, et cetera,
fMRI,
right?
things like that. Yeah.
And then we get the foreignizers who are just like, no, this is all mystical, kind of like, magical stuff from the ancient East. And they really like pile on the Orientalism and the sort of the mystique of Chinese medicine. And those are two extremes, two opposite ends of this kind of spectrum. And you find practitioners in all kind of points in between that spectrum, really trying to, and some of them really trying to grapple with, what is this? What do these texts really mean? And some of them are trying to sort of like market themselves well. And you get a whole kind of similar dynamic to what happened in medieval China. I'm fascinated by that process. As a scholar, I'm not a practitioner of Chinese medicine. So at the end of the day, I don't have to go into the clinic and decide where to stick the needle, right? So I can just sort of like observe this phenomenon as an observer and kind of comment on it and just think like, isn't this interesting? This is how cultural exchange works. This is how cross-cultural translation works. And I'm really fascinated by sort of that process of translation and adaptation.
I'm going to ask you a tricky question. I don't think anyone's brought this up yet, but it's something that triggers for me, just because Indigenous medicine is something I'm really interested in, and the process of decolonization right now, which is just such a huge issue in the world. But do you feel like what we are doing is a form of cultural appropriation? And because you're saying that, like, you feel like it was that, that what we're doing now is similar to what was happening back then. And I find that there's this really interesting balance between cultural exchange and cultural appropriation. And I'm just curious to hear what your thoughts are on that issue. It's totally racy, and you don't even have to comment if you want to, but I'm fascinated.
Um, so I also think that there's a spectrum there, and that the intentionality kind of matters, in where in what you're doing and where you fall on that spectrum. So I do think fundamentally that there's a difference between um, appropriating an indigenous cultural system from a colonized or subjugated population when you're part of the colonizing population, and you have extracted those ideas or those practices without permission and taken them and run with them. I think there's a big difference between that and the Western appreciation and fascination with Chinese medicine and Buddhism, because in both cases, both in the Chinese medicine case and in the Buddhism case, these are systems that understand themselves to be universal. In the case of Buddhism, it's explicit that this is a universal
It's a human thing.
path of liberation that should be taught to everybody, and it's a proselytizing tradition that, like, very sometimes aggressively promotes itself in new cultural climates. So I think there's already a big difference, a different starting point. But then I do think that you can engage in kind of very crass forms of cultural appropriation with both Buddhism and Chinese medicine if you're not, not studying the history, not studying the language, not understanding the whole sort of cultural Chinese world, and you're just plucking out a few practices and really kind of like using them to build your own identity or to, like, market your products. I see all these like Buddha beer or Zen, Zen whatever, right? Like this is just crass kind of like meaningless appropriation of terminology. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who spend, their lives really dedicated to learning these healing art forms, learning Buddhism, really steeping themselves in these traditions, and really taking them seriously as knowledge systems and really immersing themselves in those systems. And I think that there's a big difference. So where people are in that spectrum really has a lot to do with their intention, a lot to do with how I think how enthusiastically they're exposing themselves to learn more and more about the larger cultural worldview. So I think the kinds of initiatives that you're talking about that the cooperative is doing is actually, I think, part of the solution towards making sure that people aren't just falling into this kind of like easy commercialized appropriation.
But yeah, and it's interesting because last night everybody was talking heavily about the idea that we do need to do what has been done over generations, which is what you're studying essentially, which is that everybody taking all of what they knew before and then documenting it for themselves in a more modern context that really relates to where they are today. And because we've crossed countries, we're in a global world, like this ends up getting a little mishmashed with the whole East-West conundrum in today's world. But certainly, as you've said, it's not something that hasn't been done before. And that the idea of understanding where you've come from as being an integral part of that process is huge. I know that.
I guess,
go ahead.
I was just going to respond to that just quick by saying, coming back to this kind of spectrum that I mentioned between like domesticating versus foreignizing, right? If you're adopting Chinese medicine, you want to practice it in the modern day. A domesticating approach would be to you're situated in modern, America, modern UK, modern Canada, whatever, and you're interested in these ideas to see how you can apply them in your life today, in your context, in your culture. That's a more domesticating approach. I think, if people are self-conscious about like what they're doing and they're aware of what they're doing, I think it's really helpful. I don't think there's anything wrong with that kind of approach per se. But I think there's another alternative, which once you're kind of aware of translation and adaptation being a spectrum, and you see what's happening on the domesticating end of the spectrum, there is also the other end of the spectrum, which is something more like, Chinese medicine is a pre-modern, if you're studying it in the classical mode, not in the TCM mode, but if you're studying it in the classical mode, it's a pre-modern knowledge system with a completely different worldview and a completely different way of being in the world. And instead of like kind of cherry picking the practices or fitting the practices into the modern lifestyle or the modern kind of worldview, you could choose to really steep yourself in this new worldview in such a way that it fundamentally challenges the modernity, or fundamentally challenges the kind of preconceptions and assumptions of 20th century Western culture, and that's another way of doing it. So again, it's not to say that one's, as a non-practitioner, I don't necessarily say this one's the right one and that's the wrong one, but just to recognize that there are different ways of doing this adaptation and translation, and to encourage practitioners and students to be more self-aware about where they're positioning themselves and what they're doing with this knowledge. I think that's something that anyway, that this sort of like research that I've done can help to bring to light.
I'm really excited to hear more about what you and Ken are talking about. It's a unique perspective, I think. Not that, everybody we've talked to so far isn't well entrenched in the studies of their own classical, I got classics on my shelf behind me, but I'm not literate in Mandarin. I took 2 semesters in my doctoral program. And so, to be able to dive deep into these characters and into these really fundamental concepts of the medicine is fascinating. And then for you to be able to kind of like macro view out a little bit on that and be like, and this is the context within which this has been created. It's going to be really interesting to hear how that all plays together. And I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say. Is there anything else you want to say?
No, I guess the only other thing I would say in terms of like macro view expanding out is that so what we've been talking about here has been my research in medieval China, but I have a background that also involves having been a practitioner of traditional Thai medicine, and I'm in my academic position as the editor-in-chief of the Asian Medicine Journal, and it's kind of the Facebook communities that I have been fostering over the last 10 years or so. I also have a lot of exposure and a lot of interest in sort of Asian medicine traditions more broadly. And so seeing Chinese medicine as, one of multiple systems that are also being interpreted and translated and adapted and so forth in our culture, I see a lot of similarities, but also some stark differences in the way that some, Chinese medicine is being taken up versus Ayurveda versus Tibetan medicine versus Thai medicine. There's some really interesting differences there, depending on, the histories of those different traditions in the West. So something else that we could talk about.
Yeah, whereas like my mission is driven toward finding the similarities. Like for me personally, what I really want to do is look at these sort of we were talking like pre-modern systems of medicine that we still have access to knowledge of throughout the world, and finding out where they overlay. Like what's the Venn diagram of human medicine, right?
Yeah, I mean, my opinion is they're all similar in the sense that they're all pre-modern. Like, so they all are offering an alternative. But once you get down into the details, like they open up really different worlds, like an Indian universe, an Indian cosmos that's built out of the 4 elements that are in conflict with each other is a completely different way of being in the world than the Chinese, harmonious qi model. They're different. They're not.
The controlling cycle.
Say that again.
What about the controlling cycle?
Yeah. But the default in well, I don't have time to get into it, but you don't need to record this part. But the idea that like if you just let things be natural, that you'll be in harmony, right? That harmony prevails, right? That's a Chinese idea. That's a specifically Chinese idea. It does not work that way in any Buddhist inflected medicines, right? In Buddhist inflected medicines, suffering is the default. Suffering is the baseline, and you can try to manipulate it to try to get some health, some harmony in there, but the whole system's going to collapse, any minute. So it's just a really different way of like, being in the world and approaching health and healing when you have these two like very different ideas. They're both pre-modern, so they both move us away from biomedical determinism and physical materialism and so forth. But they move us they open up different worlds.
After I watched that preview that you guys recorded the other day, the thing that stuck out most in my mind was your awareness of this cross-cultural dynamic.
It's a fascinating subject.
Yeah, it's something that fascinates me, and I'd love to hear you just riff about it, Pierce. The importance of the cross-cultural aspect of the transmission of medical information.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just say thanks for the invitation to come and chat, and also welcome to the people that are joining us. And yeah, so I don't know if everybody actually saw that preview video or not, so maybe I'll just quickly
We should dive in.
Yeah, just quickly kind of like say that's been the major focus of my research. So I'm not a historian of Chinese medicine, as most people take that term to refer to, the body of literature around acupuncture and moxibustion and herbal medicine associated with the imperial court and the sort of official circles of Chinese history. My research is looking in the translation and adaptation of Indian medicine in China that came into China via the Buddhist texts that were transmitted predominantly from India, but also from Southeast Asia and Central Asia, that came into China, that contained these really radically different ideas about the body and about illness and about therapies. And so my research for the last 15 years or so has really focused on how those ideas were understood, translated, put into practice in China. And yeah, Ken, as you're saying, it really at its core, that is a question of cross-cultural interaction or cross-cultural exchange or cross-cultural translation. I prefer the term the concept of translation. That's kind of the frame that I use to talk about this sort of exchange of medical ideas, because even though a lot of this wasn't taking place in texts, a lot of it was, and also that is what we have as historians to work with, really, in order to be able to say anything concrete or to analyze cross-cultural exchanges from the medieval period are the texts. So I think translation, in that period for my work, thinking about this cross-cultural exchange as a process of translation has really given me a lot of useful theoretical kind of models for talking about this process.
I think the other words that you were using the other day that I responded to was the difference between people domesticating versus like foreignizing the different ideas. And that process was interesting to me as well. And I'm not sure we got to sort of flesh that out as much as we'd like to, but if you want to talk about that a little bit too, I'd love to hear more.
Sure,
I have a question. Pierce, it's my understanding that this Indian influence begins in the 1st century. Is that accurate?
Yeah, the first recorded arrival of Buddhism in China is dated to 67 CE, if I'm remembering the date correctly. It's definitely 1st century CE. That's not to say, though, that there wasn't all kinds of subterranean, cross-cultural exchanges that may have been happening below the level of written texts, below the level of records that we have available to us today. I think there's ample evidence showing that the trade routes, that China was part of a network of trade routes with India and with the Middle East going back, millennia into the Neolithic period. So there, it's very likely that aspects of Indian culture and Western culture, say, Middle Eastern culture were that China was, in communication. But there aren't, concrete historical records about Buddhist ideas, in China before the 1st century AD. And from that point onwards, it starts to become very well documented. So the 1st century CE is.
So then, if we look at
go ahead.
when you look at texts that are composed prior to the 1st century and compare them to texts that are either composed or edited after the 1st century, is there a characteristic difference?
You're talking about Chinese medical texts per se?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think sort of one of the things I was talking about in our preview conversation is that this time period that I researched, what we call the medieval period in China. So this is 3rd century to 10th century or 11th century, depending on how you carve it up. This is a time period that is in terms of let's say in terms of a general understanding of Chinese medical history, this is a period of time that's often overlooked. A lot of practitioners of Chinese medicine think of Chinese medicine as something that originates in the Han Dynasty, with texts like the Huangdi Neijing and the Bengcao Jing and the Nanjing and these other kind of like foundational texts for the acupuncture, moxibustion, and herbal medicine tradition. And then, those texts become the standard texts for the imperial medical bureaus, and they become sort of the most popular, most influential models of medicine in China in the Song Dynasty in the 11th and 12th centuries. And from that time up until today, they're at the core of the medical tradition. But the medieval period, in between the fall of the Han Dynasty and before the Song Dynasty, in that period, medicine is a lot more pluralistic than I think most practitioners usually think about. So this is a period of time where for much of that period, China didn't have a centralized government. So there wasn't a single kind of authority that was standardizing or enforcing any kind of influencing the standardization or enforcing the standardization. You have in this period Buddhism entering into China for the first time and becoming a very influential, extremely politically important and very popular religion. You have all kinds of different Taoist movements that originate in this time period, kind of all over China, different Taoist groups bubbling up and also advocating their own types of healing practices. And so, yeah, so it's a much more pluralistic environment, and all of these different traditions are writing texts and have left us, in some cases, voluminous amounts of material written about medical treatments and ideas. In that medieval period, the physicians that are affiliated with the Chinese government and the imperial bureaus, when they write texts, they often are they are often prioritizing the kind of models that you would see in the Huangdi Neijing, prioritizing that sort of Han Dynasty, imperial medical model, but their texts are often engaging very, very explicitly with Indian ideas and with Taoist ideas too. So the two kind of like most famous authors from that time period, I think that most practitioners would know, would be Chao Yuanfeng and also Sun Tzu Miao. Maybe Sun Tzu Miao is probably a household name among practitioners. these days. And
Well, I
Sun
know.
Miao's, yeah, Sun Miao's texts are filled with talismans and rituals, and he's got this whole sort of statement on ethics that is drawn from Buddhism. He's talking about Indian forms of massage, a whole lot of stuff that's not part of the sort of Han Dynasty imperial sort of medical model. So I think there is a big difference, Ken, in between texts that were written in the Han Dynasty and then texts that are written in this medieval period. And then some of you probably know the scholarship of Asaf Goldschmidt from Tel Aviv University, and he's written about the then standardization process that takes place in the Song Dynasty in the 11th, 12th century, where a lot of this kind of like medical pluralism is written out of the imperial medicine and becomes marginalized. And then from that period onwards, you have a lot less, much less overt engagement with Buddhism by elite physicians associated with the imperial kind of system. But some scholars have pointed to a more sort of like subtle Buddhist influences that continue to appear in text throughout the rest of Chinese history. So Volker Scheid has written about this recently, looking at a Ming Dynasty physician's writings and his engagements with Buddhism. So there, it's not like Buddhism just goes away and stops being a factor altogether, but it's much less overt, and the Indian medical concepts, Indian medical doctrines are much less likely to be sort of the pivotal or central organizing ideas for medical texts in the Song and later. So the period of time that I look at is a period of time in which medicine is very, like I said, very pluralistic, very diverse, very complex, all kinds of different groups advocating all kinds of different things, and Buddhism is a major player in that debate. And that means Indian medicine is actually, pretty widespread and pretty well known in China in that time period.
So do you feel like the influence of Buddhist medicine, even though it wanes a little bit in terms of Chinese medicine during the Song Dynasty, does it still hold sway in other Asian medicine forms? I mean, clearly it's still evident in what we now see is like Ayurveda and things like that as well. But can you talk a little bit about how that affects the rest of Asian medicine as well? Because I know there's also this sort of tension that we were talking about before, where like when people talk about Chinese medicine, it's Chinese medicine, but it's really not Chinese medicine. There's all kinds of Asian medicine forms, and I know you study those as well.
Yeah, so I also didn't forget the question that you asked before. Also,
oh, you're good.
So let me quickly address the other question that you had, just to put a bookmark in it, and if we want to come back to that and talk more about it, we can.
Yeah, of course.
But you asked about the domesticating, foreignizing, those two terms, and so again, that was something that came up in the preliminary conversation that we had, and this is a it's a concept that comes from translation studies, and it's one of the areas or one of the ideas that I thought was really useful from translation studies and thinking about the process that we're talking about here. So I think most people who are not professional translators probably think about translation as, you have this Indian text over here, these Indian ideas over here, and you transmit them into Chinese, and the meaning kind of like transmits across that. And so you have like, the original text is now written in Chinese, right?
Yeah,
but anybody
how that works.
Right. Anybody who speaks more than one language knows that this is not how translation works. Translation is this kind of like complex, very personal process of like extracting the meaning from the original, and then like, how do I really want to say that in this new language? And it's a social and political process too, because when I'm translating ideas, particularly medical ideas in a country or a culture where medicine is really accorded this large amount of weight in terms of the social kind of political sphere, right? Translating medical texts in that kind of environment, there's all kinds of political and social considerations that go into translating an Indian text into Chinese. And so rather than just kind of like thinking about translation as something that moves meaning from point A to point B, thinking about translation as something that's active, where the translators are making choices and where the translators are trying to pursue certain arguments or certain kinds of social goals with their translations, is a very interesting, I think, much more productive way to approach these texts. And so what we were talking about in the preliminary was this kind of spectrum between foreignizing and domesticating, which are like some strategies that different translators took with these texts. And in some cases, they went with the more domesticating approach, which would be to adapt Indian ideas to make them fit better into the Chinese cultural sphere. So in those cases, you do have texts where they're talking about Indian medical ideas, but they're translating them as qi and yin yang and wuxing, right? And they're speaking about these ideas, having adapted or translated or filtered that through a Chinese medical model. Then you have the more foreignizing end of the spectrum, which is where in the translations, the Chinese translations, these ideas are clearly tagged as being foreign ideas from India. And in many cases, they'll keep the Sanskrit terminology. They'll use Chinese characters to spell Sanskrit, right? So, or they'll use a Chinese term, a Chinese translation term that's obviously an unusual word. That's a new word that's being used in a technical new way, right? So when the reader comes to these terms, you know, a Buddhist reader in medieval China would know that, oh, these are Sanskrit terms, these are Indian terms. And so it kind of like flags these ideas as foreign. And that changes over time. We can have transformations in different strategies, you know, and sometimes foreign words become domesticated over time, and it's complex. And, you know, we're talking about a many centuries long period of time, and there's a lot going on there. But generally speaking, my argument is that in the medieval period, before the Song dynasty, a lot of translators were interested in Indian ideas because they were foreign, and were interested in foreignizing translations that really emphasize the foreign these ideas. And then after the Song dynasty kind of standardization of medicine, and you get a return to sort of a classicist kind of emphasis, which means like the Song dynasty was really wanting to go back to the Han dynasty precedents, and really also very xenophobic and skeptical about foreigners and so forth. And so there was an effort, I think, in the Song to sort of filter out all of this foreign stuff from Chinese elite culture. And so my argument is that from the Song onwards, it really is only in the domesticating translations of Indian medicine that really make it through. And the foreignized translations of Indian medicine, the stuff that's really emphasizing the Sanskrit terminology and so forth, drops out in the Song dynasty. So that's the kind of big picture. That's the argument that I make.
See,
in my
this
book.
just leads me back to the conversation we were having the other day when we were talking about the synchronicities between medicines versus like the way they approach them being different. And I think Ken and I were talking about it the other day too. Whereas I think you and I have different opinions about this, and I think you're gonna have to work hard to change my opinion, although I have no right to question your knowledge. But but when you say they're using Chinese language to sort of express these Indian ideas, that to me speaks to the idea that there are some fundamental concepts that are fluid between the cultures, right? Because there's language that's in existence to handle those things. But you have proposed that because the cultural contexts are so different, that there actually is more different about these medicines necessarily than there are the same. I think that's what you had said the other day. Tell me if I'm misquoting you.
Yeah. So I like to use the metaphor of wine. So if you don't like wine, another metaphor will do. But Chinese medicine and Indian medicine are both kinds of wine, right? And you could look at them and say, well, look, they're very similar because they're both not beer. I can look at them and say, yeah, but if you really taste them, you know, one of them's white wine and the other one's red wine. They're really different. Yeah, they're both not beer, but they're really different than one another,
Yeah.
right? So that's kind of, I don't know, that's kind of like a silly way of making the serious point, which is it depends on what you're comparing against, right? Like if you
Yes.
want to take Chinese and Indian medicine and compare them against modern biomedicine, yeah, there's some similarities there, chiefly being that they're both pre-modern, right?
Yes.
So like them both being pre-modern means that they both have assumptions baked into them that are coming from a pre-scientific, pre-modern worldview, right? And so yeah, there is some pre-modernness that they share. On the other hand, once you start actually learning the concepts, like once you actually start studying, you know, the metaphors and the concepts and the practices and so forth, it turns out they're both like in many cases diametrically opposed from one another in what they're saying, right?
Yeah, we were
So
talking about the element cycles last time. We were discussing like how the elements really illuminate for you just how different they are conceptually with the way
yeah,
they.
yeah. So should I repeat that? Should I go back into
Yeah,
that?
please. I
Okay.
like that. Yeah. And then I want to get back to the religio medicine part of
Yes.
our conversation, because this also leads me into some of the dabbling ideas I've had in animism and its effect on this sort of pre-modern medical systems. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. But please,
Okay.
let's talk about.
And then I haven't forgotten your other question either about the
Just gonna keep throwing them at you.
influence of Buddhism on different medical traditions outside of China. I'll mention that briefly before we move on to animism. But yeah, so I mean, in terms of the elements is a great example. The elements actually, this is like the perfect example of like how Indian and Chinese medicine are different, and then how they get conflated together through translation. So just to get the terminology, so in China, a lot of people talk about the 5 elements, but it's really the 5 phases or the 5 steps or processes or whatever, right? Wu Xing, right? Xing is their stages of transformation or something like that. Ultimately, the universe is built out of qi, right? And so the Wu Xing are referring to different qualities of qi. It's like, you know, a fiery type of qi or a watery type of qi, right?
Mhm.
So because the whole universe is built out of qi, is one thing, it's a unitary thing. And so in the Chinese medical classics, I don't know them as well as you guys probably do, but in the Huangdi Neijing, there's this, you know, kind of sort of very famously this kind of orientation that the natural state of the human body is one of harmony. And if you basically just kind of like, you know, don't go against the flow, if you don't go against the flow of qi or the flow of the Tao or whatever, then if you don't go against it, then you're, you know, your body's gonna be healthy, you're gonna live to a full 100 years, and this is the natural state of harmonious living. In India, on the other hand, particularly in the Buddhist way of talking about this, you don't, the universe is not made out of one thing. It's made out of 4 things: earth, water, fire, and wind. And these are not 4 like qualities of some underlying substance. They are actually 4 competing, conflicting substances. The Sanskrit term is that they're the Mahabhuta. They're the great existences. They're the great things, right? So there's these 4 great things that are independent of one another and in conflict with one another, and the world is built out of them. And then in the Buddhist representations, especially, they kind of emphasize this even more than the Ayurvedic descriptions. But what they talk about is that the natural state of the body is one of chaos, pain, suffering, and disharmony, because these four great elements are just naturally in conflict with one another. If you do nothing, they will just completely run
Eat each
out,
other.
spin out of control, and you'll die.
Yeah.
And so your life is about trying your medical, you know, health advice is about how do we balance these in order to produce a momentary kind of like break from the chaos of these elements, and then you're constantly modifying that, you know, with relation to the seasons and what you eat and your exercise and what time you wake up and all of this other type of stuff. You're constantly modifying that just to try to maintain some control over this chaotic situation. So, okay, when you look at the similarities, you could say, oh, look, both systems involve paying attention to your diet and your seasons and your activities in order to regulate some kind of in order to regulate your health, right? That's true. But on the other hand, the underlying idea in one case is that life is chaos and it's suffering and it's pain. And in the other case is that, you know, the default is that life is, you know, harmonious and healthy. And so with that really radically different starting point in your philosophy, then sort of like a lot of the practices and the kinds of advice you get and so forth is different in both systems, and the kinds of therapies are different, you know, and the whole approach winds up being different. So there's an intersecting similarity and then lots of differences. So how does that relate to
how that
translation?
affects things clinically, certainly. But
Yeah,
also, like, to me, that just says to me, all right, so that here we're still talking about a human interacting with their environment, and we've got these systems that tell a human how to correct its interaction with its environment. Now, certainly there's more going on internally or externally, depending on what system we're looking at. But this, again, it's going to take you right back to religio-medicine. We're talking about the difference between animism, polytheism, and monotheism, right? And those, but at the same time, as a human experiencing those things, you're experiencing a religion, right? And it's serving a particular set of needs that you have. That's my point. In counter to your point that they're different, is that I still think they're the same.
Yeah, I don't know how deep down this rabbit hole you want to go.
I'm not committed. I'm really not committed to going on this rabbit hole in this particular hour, but I'm still.
I'll just say that the word religion is a Western concept, and it's
no, I know we talked about that too.
Period, right? So
yes.
So like to look at either Chinese medicine or, you know, Buddhist medicine.
We could talk about religio-medicine.
In the pre-modern period, right? Religion doesn't feel like the right label to use. It may make some amount of sense to call it that from our modern vantage point today.
I think I use it today as a label for something that is filling a need to understand the things about the world within and without ourselves that we don't comprehend or have no control over.
Okay, so, well, I mean, maybe this would be helpful. I mean, when I started out by giving you the wine analogy, saying both Chinese and Indian medicine are both kinds of wine, and they're similar in that they're not beer. I think what you're pointing to when you just said that, you don't need the word religion. That's pre-modern. That is the pre-modern worldview, right? A pre-modern worldview does not distinguish rigidly between the realm of religion and the realm of science, right?
Yeah.
In any pre-modern culture, right, you have these modern categories don't really apply. You might have specialists that deal with sort of one corner of the cosmos and specialists that deal with another corner of the cosmos. And these people might be doing something that we call alchemy, and these people might be doing something that we call meditation. And these other people dealing with this other corner of the cosmos might do something that, you know, like involving animals or involving art or involving medicine or involving other sorts of disciplines. But in a pre-modern culture of any kind, these are not like distinct realms of knowledge that are incompatible and completely separated the way in the modern period we want religion and science to be, right? In a pre-modern world, there's the cosmos, and all of these specialists are working on different aspects of the cosmos, but the cosmos is unified and the cosmos is the same regardless of which discipline you're in. And this was true in the West. This was why all the people like Da Vinci, right, in the early modern period,
I was like, Da Vinci.
Artists and scientists and anatomists, and there wasn't any difference between those things, right? So I don't think you need the word religion to explain this. I think this is what I was getting by saying that Indian and Chinese medicine are both they're similar in the respect that both of them are pre-modern systems, right? They're part of the pre-modern Chinese worldview, and the other is the part of the pre-modern Indian worldview. And the pre-modern worldviews have a lot more integration than current, biomedical, the current biomedical perspective does. So to me, like, I think that's what people are actually interested in. This is my own opinion. I'm gonna make my own argument, but what I think,
Please do.
I as a person who's been around both the scholarship but also the practice of Asian medicine for a long time, I think what practitioners of Asian medicine, as well as a lot of patients, what they're really looking for is that to recapture that integration, that feeling that the whole cosmos is integrated in some way and not fractured out into these different distinct realms of knowledge, because we're going through our lives as modern people having this disjuncture, right? Where like, what, I believe this, but I have to think that, and and science is saying this, and my spirituality is telling me that, and it feels fractured. And I think what people are looking for is an integrated kind of like, some kind of integration of those realms of their life. And this is the appeal that pre-modern medicine, pre-modern spirituality, pre-modern things in general have for us moderns. That's, other scholars will probably say I'm oversimplifying, but I think that's behind a lot of the current fascination with all things pre-modern that we have.
I think you're right on both counts. I think, yes, of course, it's an oversimplification, because you can oversimplify anything. I mean, it's hard to not oversimplify things, because things are way more complicated than that. But for the general audience, and in terms of this conversation, that makes perfect sense when we start talking about how they overlap as well. You talk about the Buddhist question. Let's just talk about the geomedicine. Yeah. Come on. I mean, we started that anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. So, so you asked about the prevalence of Buddhist influence on other systems of medicine around Asia. Mm-hmm. So I have a new book coming out in right at the end of this year, which is called The Global History of Buddhism and Medicine. And in that book, I'm taking a look at this question, right? To what extent does Buddhism kind of intersect with medicine, in which cultures, and how, and what's the sort of the long-term history of that from the beginning of the tradition 2,500 years ago up until the present. And so just to make a very long story, short, very short, what I'll say is that
oversimplify it, for instance.
Yeah, oversimplified, but maybe useful starting point is that Buddhism originates in northeastern India, or it originates in India, let's say, in a cultural context where there was a certain kind of medical orientation throughout the culture that is not exactly the same as Ayurveda. But we could say Ayurveda is like, I don't know, a cousin, or it's a close relation of the kinds of medicine that you find in Buddhist texts from India. They're not 100% the same. They're not completely different from one another. So you can get a sense of the medical practices and ideas that were circulating in Buddhist circles from a lot of texts that were written in India at the time. We have texts in Sanskrit and Pali, but we have a lot of texts written that were translated in China that were subsequently lost in India. And so a lot of the evidence for this, Buddhist kind of medical practices in India could be gotten by through the Chinese translations. That's one of my interests in these translations. Anyway, what I'll say is that it appears that Buddhism was, like a vehicle for the transmission of medical ideas around Asia, because as these Buddhist texts that have medical aspects in them get translated into other languages, the medical content gets translated too. And through the spread of Buddhism, you have the spread of Buddhist ideas about medicine.
Is it kind of like the way that Catholic Church took a bunch of Latin and like spread it around the world? I feel like that happened quite a bit. in the,
Yeah, there's other,
West.
other examples. It might be like the way that, people now are all over the world are learning English, and what comes along with learning English is like Hollywood movies, right? Or
Yeah.
other aspects of American culture, American ways of talking,
I live in
that,
Scotland now, and my friends are like, all of our kids talk like the people on TV. Like, there's
yeah,
no, like, of course, there are people with Scottish accents, but like, they're not the
yeah,
same.
yeah. So, it's India in this time period was like a, center of civilization. And so people were all around Asia were, adopting Indian models of kingship, right? And all over Southeast Asia, you have these like, these models of kingship that are borrowed from India. Like in Thailand, the kings are named Rama, and they are enthroned with a whole sort of coronation ritual that is Vedic and Brahmanical, right? It's adapted from India. So anyway, there's all kinds of examples of Indian kind of adoption of Indian culture. And in my book, I basically like trace out 3 trajectories historically in the long run, over the long haul, as Buddhism carries these ideas around Asia. At one point in time, Buddhism is being practiced from Iran to Japan and from Siberia to Indonesia, right? So like basically like almost all of Asia is Buddhism is influential, and in many cases the official dominant religion of the kingdom. But over the long run, over the 2,000-year period, you have 3 different trajectories where, particularly in Western Asia, also in India and also parts of Southeast Asia, there's kind of a swath across Asia where Buddhism is replaced by either Hinduism or Islam as the major religion, and Buddhism becomes practically negligible in the long run. And in those parts of the world, Buddhist Indian medicine that's sort of like packaged up in Buddhist terms and Buddhist ideas and so forth, for the most part, dies out. But there's some really tantalizing examples of places where the Buddhist healing techniques went kind of like subterranean. They went underground and were continued to be practiced by Muslims and Hindus. And their sort of Buddhist origins were forgotten, but they continue to be practiced down to today.
They domesticated them.
Yeah, that's like extreme domestication, right? So that's one example. Then you have, or one trajectory, I mean. Then you have this other trajectory in East Asia, China, Korea, and Japan, and Vietnam, all of that in that part of the world. Buddhist medicine or Indian medicine in its Buddhist, when I say Buddhist medicine in this case, I mean Indian medicine in its Buddhist kind of textual transmission, becomes very popular in the medieval period. It's widespread, very important, imperially supported, and practiced by the elites and the elite physicians and so forth, like we were talking about, but then goes through this process of domestication and screening out, and what you're left with is largely people are still Buddhist, and they're very enthusiastic about Buddhism, and they're practicing all kinds of Buddhist healing practices and rituals, and all sorts of herbal medicines come in to the practice of Chinese medicine in this period, and there's influences galore. But in the long run, all of that is also expressed in a domesticating idiom, so that today, people might pray to the medicine Buddha for health or something, but they're not going to be praying to have their Mahabhuta or their Tridosha be balanced. They're going to pray to have their Qi or their Yin Yang or their Wu Jing or whatever, right? So it's going to be in a domesticated idiom. Then there's the third trajectory. And so this is, if I go from like north to south, I would say Mongolia, Tibet, parts of Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, in that sort of like swath, and it's kind of like right in the middle, in between India and China, in between South Asia and East Asia, right? In that part of the world. Oh, and Sri Lanka too. In that part of the world, you have Buddhist traditions of medicine, or medicine that comes in alongside Buddhism, becomes institutionally important, becomes extremely influential, becomes extremely, the predominant form of medicine in those countries. And that situation continues to today. Obviously now biomedicine is the sort of hegemonic global kind of form of medicine, but in each one of those countries, you have major ongoing engagement with traditional medicine systems. And in all of those countries that I named, those traditional medicine systems are explicitly Buddhist in their character. So in Mongolia, Nepal, Bhutan, and Tibet, you have the sort of the Sowa Rigpa, which is the so-called Tibetan medicine, which is this whole sort of, it's an amalgam of Indian and Chinese and Muslim ideas, and it's as diverse as any other form of medicine that's out there, but it is attributed to being the teaching of the medicine Buddha, and it includes all kinds of Buddhist rituals and practices associated with it. A little bit less known is Thai medicine, Burmese medicine, Sri Lankan medicine, Lao, Cambodian traditional medicine. Really kind of the same situation there. You have these traditions that are explicitly Buddhist. Their teachings are supposedly originated from Buddhist masters, Buddhist individuals, or Buddhas or Bodhisattvas or whatever. Their practice involves all kinds of Buddhist ritual. And importantly, also in all of these places, it's Buddhist monasteries and temples that have really promoted and been centrally important in the long-term sort of promulgation and success of those traditions. So to answer your question, yeah, I think Buddhism's everywhere in traditional medicine, all over Asia. It's subterranean in some places.
Cultures.
It's domesticated in other cultures, and then it's very much explicit and very much on the surface in other cultures. And it just kind of depends where you are in Asia, to what extent that, which one is the main pattern. And then, of course, as we in the modern period, all of these traditions have now kind of initially gone through a suppression phase where they were really, subjugated usually by colonial or other kinds of processes, right? And then now there's a revival movement where they've really started to come back. They've been globalized, they've been commercialized, they've been spread all over the world, right? And so now, kind of like in some of the Buddhist resonances between different traditions that historically may have been kind of separate from one another are being sort of rediscovered, and becoming maybe magnified or maybe more sort of like highlighted by practitioners in a way that maybe wasn't done 500 years ago or 600 years ago, but is leading to some interesting kind of comparisons and some interesting connections that previously maybe wouldn't have been possible.
I think that segues into the next question I have for you really nicely. But the setup for that is that we had previously talked about how part of what we started on this was the idea that like the medicine cross-pollination had been happening for, thousands of years, basically, that we've just been, that culturally we've been kind of like sharing medicine back and forth. And I think when we were talking before, I was talking to you a little bit about one of the conversations that we'd had up on the co-op, the most recent one, I think, where we were discussing the fact that in every generation, well, not every generation, but every so often within the practice of these medicines, we can go back to the classics that we've studied forever, but there will come a time when we need to sort of reinterpret that medicine for where we are today in the world. And the conversation we had been having was specifically related to pandemic life. How do we take the classical Chinese medicine texts that we have been studying and interpret them and then add to them in the same way that people have been doing for their because Chinese medicine, as you had said, you're studying the period where Sun Si Miao is talking about, like, I think we were we were, we're talking about things like the Wenbing and like all of the rest of our classics, like all of our classics are from a period of time where somebody has come together, looked at everything they knew and said, and this is how I'm going to explain it to you now. So if we are now once again at that time where we're trying to do this with our medicine, and I'll say Asian medicine and not just Chinese medicine, because I think clearly there's an intersectionality here that's important to address, but what should we be talking about with regard to how we're doing that now? And where should we be looking for the source material? Like, do we have blind spots here? Where should we be looking to gather this material and really sort of like make the best of what we have right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I have my historian's hat on, like, I don't know if the historian is the right person to ask where should we go, but I have some ideas that I'll just sort of like share with you that came up while you were talking. So I mean, one of them is that, a perspective I think might be helpful from the historian's perspective is that I think we historians would argue that well, let me back up. I think what you expressed is a common way of thinking for practitioners, which is that there's like a tradition out there that we reinterpret today for our purposes, right? Or that we need to reinterpret today for our purposes. The way I would say that
would be helpful.
Yeah. The way I would sort of like, I don't know if challenge is the right word, but maybe like what I might add to that is I think from historians' perspective, what you're calling tradition is and actually Volker Scheid's written about this, who's part of the practice community of Chinese medicine practitioners, so maybe some people already know his work on that, but I mean what you're calling tradition, right, the tradition of Chinese medicine was never anything other than people reading texts and thinking about how to apply them in their own lives in their own times, right? I mean, that's like the definition of what tradition is transmissions of knowledge down from people, whether it's textual, whether it's oral, right? And then the reapplication of that knowledge in the current day for each generation of practitioners that has gone, right? So I guess one perspective is just to say, like, the process that you're talking about isn't some aberration in the history of Chinese medicine that comes up every once in a while. It's literally like the only thing that it's the only thing that's ever been done in Chinese medicine, right? It's the only thing that's ever happened in Chinese medicine.
I feel like I've been waiting for Godot. Like, what should we do? What we've always done, Didi. We're waiting for Godot. We can't leave. Yeah.
Right. So I think, I mean, so that at once kind of, that I think that maybe like makes the stakes, like, I mean, the stakes are high, but there may be like, it may not be such like a unique and pivotal moment right now, right? Then because it's very similar to what practitioners have done all along. So that's one thing that came up.
Thank you for the perspective. It's a good thing to think about.
And that's always included. It's always included adaptation to local realities, right? So I mean, it's hard to remember that with China because China has been so unified politically, and the voice that you hear in the elite medical literature is like it's the voice of elites, right? So so it may be hard to remember that, but like you can see this very clearly if you go next door to Korea or Japan or Vietnam, where you can see that, like, I mean, for centuries, the whole sort of like notion of tradition in places like that, adjacent to China, has been a balance between respecting and adopting the Chinese models, but then also innovating and adapting them to the local situation. Because here in Korea, we have different plants than they had in China when they wrote this text, or here in Japan, we have different weather than they had in China, or whatever. So there's constantly a kind of a localization process that takes place through that adaptation across generations.
Which is
And
hard to do right now, I think, for us, because we're not living in a local culture right now. Now is a unique period because we're living in a global world. So it's like
yeah,
we're not necessarily forced to be like, what herbs should we use right now? Because I can
yeah,
just call up my supplier who grows them in China and have them shipped to the UK, and
yeah,
so
yeah.
I think it's an interesting point. I agree with you. The localization is a piece of that, but it does
And
add a unique twist to what we're doing today.
I think so. And I think it's, I mean, this is where like, this isn't my expertise to decide this, but I think the practitioner community has to decide this. But like, yeah, are your patients best served by importing herbs from China versus like finding local herbs that are locally grown that are going to kind of replace or maybe augment the pharmacopoeia, right? You guys have to decide, does a COVID patient, long tail COVID patient in Arizona receive the same treatment as a long tail COVID patient in Beijing? Does it even make sense to think about those as being analogous cases? Like, you guys have to decide
No.
that.
I think in general, the medicine dictates that that is not the case. I mean, the
That would
medicine
be what I would
itself, the
say.
system of medicine says that you can't treat those two patients the same, that the strength of the medicine itself is about
Yeah.
its uniqueness. And it's one of the draws, in the same way that the religio medicine, Shen body like connection that we were
Yeah,
talking about before.
which then makes, it makes the practice of this form of medicine something that you can't rely on the texts for to tell you the easy answer of what to do. You can't just pull the formulary from the Wuhan hospital and just expect that to work. It puts I think it puts, I mean, my opinion is it puts an ethical responsibility on the practitioner to be extremely informed, not only about the sort of Chinese side of Chinese medicine, but also about the kind of the process of localization and adaptation and so forth that Chinese medicine is going through as it's being practiced in the West. I think it puts an ethical obligation on every practitioner to really educate themselves about all of that. And it makes it much more complicated, I think, than just, a rote kind of adaptation or translation from point A to point B. And we're just going to practice this form of medicine here. So anyway, I mean, that was one thought. And then I had another thought that came up with your question too. And this is another metaphor I use a lot, which I call the ocean of practice. My point is that texts are always kind of like stale distillations of one or another practitioner's viewpoint about what should be done ideally. And when we look back in history, we have these like monumentally influential texts, and you mentioned Wen Bing and Huangdi Neijing, I think, or Sun Tzu Miao or whoever, like all of those texts that people read, even the textbooks that you're trained in as an acupuncturist in a Western speaking, in an English speaking culture, right? Like each one of these are texts that are written by a particular author in a particular time and place with a particular agenda and a particular opinion about like what should be done and how, right? And I think of them like little bits of sea foam or little bits of seaweed or little bits of wood that are floating on top of this massive ocean, what I call the ocean of practice, right? And the ocean of practice is like the clinical decisions that are being made every day by hundreds of thousands of practitioners around the world, right? That are never written down, that are never discussed publicly, that are just like you and your client or your patient. And it's just your own gut feeling about what you're doing, or your own intuition, or your own inspiration, or your own synthesis, your own innovation, whatever it is that you're doing all the time. And that's what the practice of traditional medicine is that ocean of practice, right? And then the texts, no matter how important we think they are, no matter how like influential they are historically, they're always just the sea foam at the top, and they don't represent the full depth of the ocean of practice. And I don't know what I'm arguing there from like a practitioner's perspective, but I would
You're
say it like,
arguing yourself out of a job, because if we don't write down these things, then future historians who want your job thousands of years from now are going to have nothing to go on.
I mean, I guess what I would argue is like, I guess what I'm arguing is like, yes, read the text, right? They're important. Like sometimes they're all we've got. Sometimes it's what you need to get started. You know, there's great ideas in there, but always remember it's one person's opinion, one person's agenda, and then take that back down into the ocean of practice and figure out what it means for you, what it means for your community, what it means for your own culture, what it means for your own environment, right? And maybe like speaking, you know, oral communication, community building between practitioners to discuss and share these ideas and interpretations. To me, that's way more important than like what some guy said in China 1500 years ago in some text, right? That's my opinion though, and I'm not a practitioner, but like what I see a lot is in the Asian medicine world, I'm not going to point fingers here, but like across the Asian medicine world, what I see a lot is people treating the medical classics as if they're like fundamentalist adherents of a religion, and that's like the Bible of their religion. Well, this text says we must do it this way, right? And therefore, like that's the one and only way. And then they go out into the community and like argue with each other and make all this bad blood, right? Instead of like, and then they're like, you know, it's isolating themselves, and it's just them and their text, right? Against the world. So to me, that's completely backwards. That's just like putting all of your energy into like clutching at the sea foam and not participating in the ocean of practice, which is innovating, putting these ideas into play, like really being aware what's working, what's not working, what's helpful, what's not helpful, and discussing and relating to your colleagues in your field, and really sort of like, you know, collaborating with them, maybe cooperating with them in order to you know, in order to put this knowledge into practice and really see what's working for us in this time and place.
Yeah, and I feel like the co-op mission that we're working with right now is, I'm very much enjoying it, because you have the benefit of, you know, being highly literate in these languages. I like most of the acupuncturists practicing today are fairly crippled, at least in the West, because I'm not literate in the language of this medicine. And so one of the things I'm loving about the co-op is being able to go back and say, let's dig into this character and let's figure out what it really means and what it really says. And so the translational work is fascinating, but I love your perspective that all translational work comes with an agenda and a perspective. And to keep an open mind about that, I think is important. This is a conversation that comes up a lot when you talk about Chinese medicine, and you get Chinese medicine practitioners talking about Chinese medicine when we discuss the fact that, and perhaps it's all pre-modern medicine systems and not just Chinese or Asian medicine, but the concept that the whole human being is both a spiritual and a physical human being, and that the simple fact that the medicine system has a construct within which we can address the wholeness of that human, both spiritual and physically, is something that is absent in most modern medicine today, and is one of the reasons why it's so popular for healing right now. And I think just as a counterpoint to that more than anything else, but it is something we talk about a lot, and I'm fascinated to learn more about how all of the different kinds of pre-modern medicine address healing from the human viewpoint. And I think coming out of a pandemic, we're talking about, you know, mental health problems are on the rise. The fascinating thing now is, of course, modern medical science is now actually able to track all of these things for us. And we recognize this split now between mental health and physical health, and we see mental health problems rise in the midst of all of this, but we are not necessarily equipped to manage that because it's a brave new world every day, right?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess so I agree with a lot of what you were saying. I guess I have a slightly more optimistic viewpoint about contemporary biomedicine, not necessarily modern, because I think things were much more kind of divorced than they are now. I think the models of, for example, the biopsychosocial model, and I think the placebo research, and there's some other areas of biomedicine that I think are quite self-consciously, and I've also followed a lot of the medical research on prayer and healing at a distance and things like that, which is more marginal, admittedly, but there's still, I think, are some interesting trends within biomedicine that are clearly indicating moving in a direction of reintegration of
I agree with you.
a wider view on what human health consists of.
Yes. I think we're getting better. I think we're coming out of a period of sort of like not great stuff, but even, and this is the fascinating thing. We talked a little bit about integrative medicine the last group talk we had, and my feeling on the education I was given in integrative medicine is that it's kind of like let's all learn how to play in the sandbox, guys, right? And my education in California with my doctoral degree included a lot of biomedicine. I took a lot of biomedicine and I took a lot of Chinese medicine. I only took 2 semesters of medical Chinese, so I'm lacking on the linguistics, which is part of where the co-op is focused on. But I do think that integrative medicine could be a fascinating new realm when we begin to say, okay, how are we going to combine all of this together? It certainly has possibilities. I do still feel like in practice, and particularly now with our Western medical systems being so taxed post-pandemic, I mean, there's not enough people, too many patients, everyone's tired. There's just not capacity to deal post-pandemic. And so I do have concerns about that, but certainly the future was looking very bright, I think, a few years ago, and a lot of people coming into it saying, I want to study all of these things and I want to learn all of this stuff and I want to figure that out, and that's exciting.
Well, I mean, so like I have a few thoughts here, but like one of them is the situation you just described, right? Like the burnout and the overtaxing of the system, and the sort of like I don't know, a crisis of like an ethical crisis in many respects, and a crisis of like trust and so forth that you've just described, like in and of itself is an integrative problem. It's a problem that is not just financial and personnel, but it's also psychological, and it's also social, and it's very much political, and it's very much spiritual, right? And
it's the kind of catalyst that makes change historically, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, it could. That's what the point I was going to make, is that it could be that ironically it's that very breakdown that points to a new sort of synthesis, at the very heart of it, that points people at the very heart of biomedicine towards a new synthesis, or at least alerts them to the need for a new synthesis. So that's one thought. These are kind of unrelated, but another thought just on the side is that in my experience, integrative medicine, that phrase usually means let's create a little annex in our hospital over there where acupuncturists and massage therapists can hang out, but not really integration. It's sort of like it's not conceptual integration. It's not. It's definitely not an integrated. It's definitely not where we're going to allow those people to challenge the kind of scientific underpinnings of biomedicine or anything like that, right? It's more of a sort of a tolerance and maybe even an appropriation of the traditional medicine into biomedicine.
We're not domesticating the medicine at that point. right? We are
Right.
foreignizing the medicine. And so the ideal, I think, would be is for an integrative medicine context that we would be taking and domesticating the medicine within our
Well,
world, right?
so I mean, so this is what I was talking about with like, that's a pre-modern, it's a pre-modern vision, right? That the thought that the mainstream biomedical hospitals, public health, like that whole system will be able to have full coherent epistemological integration with Chinese medicine, right? It's an idea that is, or with, spirituality, or with any other sort of like model, right? That is what I mean by this sort of like pre-modern, this yearning for a pre-modern world where everything integrates perfectly together, right? Where everything
Yeah.
is sort of like unified into one kind of cosmology, that medicine and spirituality and psychology and whatever else could all be part of the same worldview. That I think that became impossible, 500 years ago, and will not happen again. I don't have a desire to go back to a pre-modern kind of worldview. I know some people do, a lot of people do, but that's not my view. So we move into the modern period, where science becomes like, the definition of modernity for many scholars is that, this is the period of time in which science and empirical thinking and rationality, whatever, becomes sort of like the globally hegemonic system of thought, and everything that doesn't fit with that becomes marginalized, right? And so what we're talking about now is kind of this moment in the 21st century is kind of an emergence out of that modern world where only the observable scientific kind of like material substrate of the human being, where that's the only thing
Pendulum.
that matters. But I don't
Mhm.
think we're going to go back to a pre-modern thing where everything
No.
gets nice integrated. What I think we're looking for is, I think we're in a kind of a postmodern fracturing, where you have across our culture some people who are like materialist atheists who are like pushing that angle, and then you have some people that are completely on the sort of like, spiritual new age sort of end of things, and you have some people that have completely adopted like a Chinese worldview for their medicine, but that in a different context they might adopt a different view, and there's all of these different kind of worldviews that are, I think, in conflict with one another, and they lead to all of this argumentation and debate and so forth that we see in social media and in our politics, right? The whole kind of, I won't open this can of worms, but the whole sort of debate over the vaccines for COVID, and specifically how they split the Chinese medicine community between vaccine pro and con, and you see these kind of like fault lines all across our society on the basis of these different kind of like worldviews that people have in different contexts. A lot of people that I read sort of describe that whole situation as the postmodern condition, or this is the post-modernity, and that we are now sort of like, I think what we're talking about, you and me, Beth, here is like looking for something for the next thing beyond that kind of like fractured and contentious kind of divisions that we have. What's next? What's the postmodern? What's the next thing gonna look like? For me personally, I don't think it's going back to a modern or a pre-modern way of doing things. I think the possibility of one of these models winning, I think is done, and the possibility of all of us coming to some nice harmonious agreement about how they all fit together is also done. And I think we're moving in a different direction, and it's going to be interesting to see how that develops. I have my ideas about that. I've given a couple talks about that, but about where to go in the future. I have a couple blog posts and so forth, but really that's just speculation, because we don't really know.
Come back, we'll do another talk on that. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, well, if anybody's interested, you can just look at my name and then Meta.
Google him. He's really easy to find.
Yeah, I think I'm the only Pearsager around, but then Meta Modern, META Modern. So I wrote a series of 4 blog posts on Meta Modern Asian medicine, just kind of like thinking through some of these issues.
I'm just going to put that in the chat. What I wanted to say that I think was kind of the topic that we were dancing around just now, but I feel like you said it really well when we were talking last time, is the idea that this could challenge the preconceptions of modernity. And I liked the way that was phrased, because I feel like what that encourages all of us to do is to ask questions. And I think if we are indeed, as I think we all understand that we are, in a place where we have 2 sides that are diametrically opposed and unlikely to come together, that, in my opinion, the sanest place to be is asking questions. And to say, let's just see if we can challenge all the preconceptions. What are the preconceptions that we have, and can we challenge them? And the idea that we're poised to do that is, I think, is probably the most inspiring piece, because the rest of it's all pretty dark otherwise.
Yeah. So yeah, so in my work, in those blog posts I was referring to, I kind of, you said 2 camps. I have 3 camps. So I have the like traditionalist camp, right, and the sort of pre-modern camp, the modern camp, and then kind of the scholars who actually, I think, are doing what you're saying. The scholarly community that I'm a part of, we prioritize critique, so raising questions about other people's points of view, and critiquing them or pointing out the inconsistencies or just even identifying them
In a
is
cordial
enough.
and encouraging way.
Sometimes, I mean, but sometimes scholars, particularly of Asian medicine, I've seen a lot of scholars be quite dismissive of Western practitioners of Chinese medicine, for example, or Western practitioners of Asian stuff more generally.
Yes, absolutely.
I've seen scholars be very dismissive of the motives and the kind of the knowledge base and so forth. So it's not always.
Do you think that's because of the cultural appropriation, which I think we previously established is not necessarily cultural appropriation, but do you feel like it's because of suspicion against that, or do you think it's just?
I think there's.
Frankie.
I think I think some adaptations or adoptions of Asian medicine by Westerners are very easy to critique using longstanding academic concepts like Orientalism or romanticization or whatever, commodification, right? These are terms that we already have in our tool belts, right, as scholars, and so it's pretty easy to take a look at whatever's happening with this yoga community and just be like, oh, well, let me pull out my Orientalism tool and my commodification tool, and I've got a dissertation that I can, or a book I can publish very easily. So in some respects, it's kind of like low hanging fruit that's just easy to critique. And then, but I do think also that academics and practitioners belong in or habitate different silos, different social circles that don't overlap in many respects, and so don't often have the opportunity to get to know each other very well. And so with that sort of social dynamic, it becomes really easy for historians to say, oh, these practitioners are a bunch of nut jobs that are just kind of dialing it in, and the practitioners can say, oh, those academics are a bunch of cranky old ivory tower folks, and then just to not talk to each other on that basis. So I mean, one of the things that I've really spent a lot of time in, just as an aside, I've spent a lot of time on trying to generate venues for those kinds of conversations to take place. That's what the Asian Medicine Zone website and Facebook group are about. I'm also part of the International Association for the Study of Traditional Asian Medicine, IASTAM.org, which is an international organization that tries to foster these kinds of conversations with a major international conference that we've held every 3 or 4 years, except for in 2020.
Except for that 1 year.
Yeah, and I edit the journal, the professional academic journal for this organization, where we regularly have practitioners' voices, in the publication. So I think, anyway, there are some venues to have these kinds of dialogues, which I think are really useful, and really helpful on both sides. I think, as a scholar who started as a practitioner myself, I can point to very specific ways that I think scholarship can inform practice, and vice versa, right? So
Yes.
I think it's very, very useful. But I agree with you, that so back to your comment about like raising questions, like that's the scholar's job, right? The scholar's job is to come into any situation and be like, let's raise all these questions, all these critiques, all these kind of like, analyses or whatever that we do. But the difference is the scholar, right? Like that's really great for us because we can write our articles and get our articles published. That's our job, right? Our job is done. I critique the heck out of that group and I wrote 4 articles about them in a book. I'm gonna get tenure. I'm gonna, like that's my job. My job's done, right? What the scholar doesn't have to then do is see a patient in the clinic the next day and decide like, where do I stick the needles, right? So there's a way that raising questions, I think, can really, like, engaging seriously with scholarly work, I think is really helpful for practitioners. It really can blow away a lot of the sort of like Orientalism, the kind of like commodification, the kind of like romanticized, fantasies that scholars have about like practicing some ancient Chinese thing that's like, I'm doing it just like they did back, 6,000 years ago or whatever, right? So it can really help to blow away some of that kind of nonsense. But then the practitioner has to then go into the clinic and decide what to do, right? So raising questions it's only helpful to the extent that it then can become, maybe not immediately, but eventually become clinically applicable.
Yeah.
And so I think that's, it's a, what would we say, like a difference in priorities or a difference in outcomes between scholars and practitioners that's just kind of baked into the system that we're never going to do away with. That the scholars, you're never going to get a scholar to think about how do I apply this in the clinic, because we don't know about the clinic. And we scholars should never expect the practitioners to just be happy with the critique. They need to know what to do in the clinic. So to me, that's a recipe for collaboration,
Yes.
rather than one group dominate over the other. So my point sort of, just that this is a very long-winded response to your thing about like what you said is like the future, the path to the future is probably in raising a lot of questions.
Mhm.
Kind of the take-home point of those blogs that I mentioned is for me, the kind of the path forward is collaboration, and it's specifically interdisciplinary collaboration across these divides between the kind of traditional pre-modern, the sort of like biomedical, scientific, modern clinical trials kind of oriented study of traditional medicine, and then the scholarly kind of like critical academic side of things. So having dialogue between those 3 parties about the fact that their goals are different, and the fact that their methodologies are so different, but yet we might still be able to learn from each other. To me, that's the way forward. Collaboration, dialogue, collegial interactions with each other across those divides. To me, that's the way.
The other thing that I hear when you're saying that too is that the idea that like sort of we all have our own job description in this paradigm, right? Everyone gets to do what they do best. And really, if we're all allowed to do what we do best, and we respect each other for the other things that each other are doing best, that's how we come to, the best outcome. So I feel like a renegotiation of job description. There's a lot when you're in this kind of place right now that feels a little wild westy, where you're like, oh, maybe this will. When things feel like they're changing or an upheaval, I think a lot of times people attempt to just like do it all, and I don't think that serves. I don't think that serves in this circumstance, because clinician practitioners don't have the time to do the scholarly research that scholars do. Like we would like to learn from the scholars, and scholars would like to, hear more about how our situation in the clinic, because that's practical evidence that can be used to further research. And so those are, and I think the same thing goes for integrative medicine. When you start talking about biomedical practitioners and other forms of medicine practitioners, be they Ayurvedic medicine or Chinese medicine,
or even in the
Um,
kind of the, I mean, just look at like pandemic response, for example. Like, if ever there was a need for interdisciplinary collaboration, right? Like in terms of the pandemic response, like, there was all of the biomedical stuff, the kind of the research on the vaccines, or the understanding where the virus comes from, how does it work, how do we transmit it, all the way to the vaccines and ongoing. Then there's all the public health stuff. How do we deal with populations and
Yeah.
social distancing and all of that? Then there's all the like psychological stuff that comes up with it, the political stuff, the economic stuff, the social stuff, and then yeah, I think Asian medicine has a lot that it could have contributed and has been contributing to this conversation too. But a lot of times that is happening in these kind of like silos, right? Where
there's a hierarchy that then cuts off the value of some arguments instead of allowing them to have equal weight in their own field of knowledge. We end up getting hierarchical situations.
And I would say that goes both ways. So
oh yeah.
So yes, NPR had on a lot of public health and biomedical people, and I don't think they had on any, or I haven't heard any Asian medicine practitioners, for example. But I've also been part of Asian medicine circles where everybody is poo-pooing the science and the vaccines, and that's the same problem, just in the other direction, right? So I think there's a kind of a puritanical or fundamentalism.
Yeah, I think
in all of these communities.
Yes.
In all of these communities, that makes them have a confirmation bias towards only hearing the arguments that they already agree with, and not be open to hearing something completely outside the realm of what their expertise is, that may be contributing something really important. And I see that like every community is so thoroughly puritanically fundamentally committed to their own perspective that kind of dialogue across those interdisciplinary lines is largely impossible in many cases is impossible in our pandemic response, right? And that's just one example. So yeah, I mean, again, I'm not saying the science has everything right, the Asian medicine has everything right, or the public health officials have everything right, or the politicians have everything right. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm saying the only way forward, to my mind, is really emphasizing interdisciplinary research, interdisciplinary communication, interdisciplinary collaborations. Pandemic's a huge issue, obviously, but I think the same lesson applies to all across the board, to all sorts of different issues that we have in our community.
Yeah, I think I agree. This has been fun. I think we should do this again. Clearly, you need to join the co-op and do this lots. I think that would be important. So, was there anything
Well, we'll
else
see.
you
I'll be
wanted to
interested
say?
to know. I'll be interested to know how, how interested people are in these kinds of perspectives, and how useful they are.
Yeah.
For
Well, we'll
your
definitely
community.
get the recording of this up on the co-op website, which will be available for free to all co-op members. So if you have a co-op membership, it'll be available to you. And if you wish to use a portion of it for your own needs, hopefully we can get some of this stuff out there in other ways. Because as I said in the beginning, and I think most of the co-op members agree with this, is it's about getting the information out there. And as you said, having more conversation is the way forward, right? Being able to talk about these things and discuss the viewpoints is important. So
Yeah, so I mean, that's my primary interest. So if if the co-op becomes a place where those kinds of conversations are happening between scholars and practitioners and people with different viewpoints, and it's happening in a productive and, you know, mutually edifying way, that's what I've been sort of focusing on for many years now. That's my kind of, that's the kind of community that I like to be involved in. And it's pretty unique and rare and exciting when that is happening. So I certainly, I know this is the first sort of big event for the co-op, so I would love to, you know, see more of that kind of, you know, that kind of a community develop.
Yeah, we've been doing these talks for the last few weeks, so we've got a few that are up on the website. There's been some new activity. The best thing I can tell you, because I've been to all but one of the talks so far, I've done technology and moderated some, but that is that every single time we talk about this, new questions come up, new things are brought to light, new interest is generated. And so to me, that's the best evidence that I can think of that it's something that is needed and wanted. And also, it's just kind of exciting to realize that every week you can talk to somebody new and learn something new and be inspired to learn more about something new, which is also, I think, really important. And the other thing I like about the co-op is the idea that we've got teachers and we've got students, and that the idea is that we drive that together, right? Because the students are the ones who are like, this is the information I want, and the teachers are the ones who are like, this is the information I have. But if we can bring those things together in a way that's meaningful and useful, I think it's going to be awesome. So.
Well, I mean, yeah, so that's pretty good for just being around for a couple of weeks. So I think it bodes well for the future. So good luck with everything. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me be a part of it.
Yeah, thank you. It was a wonderful talk, and I'm just excited to be able to add your perspective to our growing library of information on these subjects. So that's wonderful. All right.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for being here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Beth.
Thank you.
Yeah. Have a good rest of your day.
I will.